Hi everyone, thanks for logging into another week of our church online services. Hopefully the countdown clock has begun and we can start looking forward to getting back together physically in person. We don't know exactly when that's going to be yet, but keep your eyes open for more information as we are able to plan our next steps out of this lockdown and hopefully back to gathering together in person as normal as possible in the coming weeks or months. This week though, we're starting our new series in the book of Esther. I've had lots of good feedback from people saying that they're really looking forward to getting into this book. It's a book they'd heard a bit about or they'd studied a bit before, and just really interesting to see how this book opens up for us as a church. But as we start, I want us to consider these words by Plato. The saying is ascribed to him, "Those who tell the stories rule society." And it's actually interesting that another group, the Hopi people of southwestern America, actually also have this saying, "Those who tell the stories rule the world." They're two very similar statements, very similar ideas from very different types of people. How is it that one of the forefathers of the modern Western mind and a small group of semi-nomadic tribes people from southwestern America can come to the very same conclusion? Well, because the power of stories is a power that almost all human beings have experienced and known in a way. Both Plato and the Hopi people knew the influence, the guidance, and the knowledge that a powerful story could impart. And that's exactly why for the next 8 weeks, we're going to be diving deep into this story, this biblical story, the story of Esther. Now I'm sure, like I said, many of you have heard about Esther, many of you have read the book of Esther, some of you have probably even studied the book of Esther. It is a Sunday school favourite. And like all good stories, there's the heroes and the villains, there's the plot, there's the crisis, and then there's a conclusion. As a book, it reads well. It's full of plot twists and turns, and it ends with a happily ever after of sorts. But it is also bloody and violent and morally ambiguous, and it lacks some details that we would probably deem pretty vital. So why is the book of Esther in the Bible? What's its point? And what are we meant to take away from it? I think these are all questions that we need to ask, because whether you like it or not, Esther is a controversial book. It is a book with lots of problems and challenges. There are questions left unanswered, historical challenges that I think we should consider, and behaviours that we need to be scratching our heads about. I'll give you probably the biggest issue in Esther up front. The biggest point of contention in the whole book is that God is never addressed. He's never alluded to. He's never even spoken about in the whole book. And considering that Esther is within the Bible, you'd think that's a pretty important detail. One good commentator put it this way: if you took out the word Jews from the book of Esther, it would have nothing to do with the Bible. Now, this isn't necessarily a problem. I actually think it's quite deliberate, but we'll get back to that point later. Yet because of this lack of God in the book of Esther, it was clear to some scribes a few generations later that a couple of additions needed to be made. What we have in our Bibles today as the book of Esther is deemed to be the original Hebrew story. Though what you will actually find in many Catholic Bibles is something called the Apocrypha. And within that Apocrypha, there is a more expanded version of the book of Esther. Now, that expanded version includes God's role in the story, and he's included in much more loud and obvious ways. But the origin of this apocryphal extra additions actually finds its origins much later than the original book. It's likely from when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, which was the language of the day. But that issue and some of the moral ambiguity that arises within the book led even someone like Martin Luther to say this: "I am so great an enemy to the second book of Maccabees and to Esther that I wish they had not come to us at all, for they have too many heathen unnaturalities." On top of that, Esther isn't mentioned in the New Testament at all. It's not even alluded to. And yet it forms the foundation of one of the major Jewish festivals, the celebration of Purim. And even within Jewish historical settings, there's some contention as well. Because when Bedouin sheep farmers found or led archaeologists to the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, that very famous historical discovery, Esther within the collection was nowhere to be found. Now, the people of Qumran, we know, were people who dedicated their lives to the protecting and living out of the ancient Hebrew scriptures. Yet why was Esther missing? And despite all of this, the story of Esther has been a powerful narrative for the Jewish people. It has given them hope in some of the darkest periods of their history. It was a story that is well known to have been repeated through the camps of the Jewish Nazi concentration era. It was a source of hope for them in desperate times when it felt like God was silent to them. And yet it also sparked nationalistic terrorism. On the 25th of February 1994, which was the date of the festival of Purim that year, American-born Benjamin Goldstein stormed into the cave of the patriarchs, which was acting as a synagogue, and he murdered 29 people, injuring 125 more. All of that was done before he was beaten to death. Goldstein believed he was continuing on the heritage of the book of Esther. There are lots of questions that the book of Esther raises, ancient questions, modern questions. And lots of these things we're going to have to address as we work our way through the book. Hopefully we can hit on most of them. Hopefully we can walk away from this book confident in what it says to us today. Because that is the key question. Where does the book of Esther fit for the church today? What does it say? And what does it mean, more importantly, in light of Jesus and all that he has said and done? Well, that's what the next 8 weeks are going to be all about. The story of Esther for the church today. Today, though, is going to be a little different. Today is about us understanding the book as a whole. So hopefully by the end of this sermon, you'll be able to have an overarching understanding of the plot, the characters, and most importantly, the purpose of the book. Then for the next 7 weeks, we're going to be taking big chunks of the story, one at a time, considering them in a more in-depth and focused kind of way. But before we begin with the story, let's pray. God, today we start the book of Esther, and you know the role that you played in this book. You know why it is that we have it as a church, and you know the important part it should play in our faith. And so God, I pray as we as a church dive into this book that you might make clear again and again, not only the role that you played in Esther, but more importantly, the role that you are playing here and now, not only in our world, but also in our individual lives. May we see from the story of Esther a message that rings true for us today as a church. In a day and age where life is just more and more confusing, where there's more reason to be afraid, when there's lots of questions and doubts being raised about the future, God, may we once again place our faith and our trust in you, a God who has acted, a God who is acting, and a God who we know will act in the future. May our faith be strengthened in this series, and may we learn more and more to trust in you in everything that we do because of what you have achieved in Jesus. It's in his name we pray today. Amen. Now, before we get into it, I'd love it if you haven't already to stop and read or listen the story of Esther as a whole. If you have the YouVersion Bible app on your phone, or if you don't, feel free to download it. You can actually read and listen along to the book in about 30 minutes. I'd really encourage you to pause this video right now and do that, because if you haven't already, it will actually help you understand the book of Esther as a whole. And I'd actually encourage you to not only do that today, but do that a few times or every week as we go through this series, because the book of Esther is a short story that was designed to be read from start to finish in one sitting. Now, because today is an overview sermon, there's no one particular text we're going to be focusing on, but we're going to be bouncing around through the whole book. So we'll be reading quite a few chunks, and hopefully that'll help us understand the story and its purpose. But to begin, let's just map out the story and its characters. Let's see the plot and the characters of the book of Esther. The story begins by introducing the big man of the day, King Xerxes the Great, who was arguably the most powerful human being in the world at that time. Xerxes was also known by his Hebrew name, Ahasuerus, which is why many of our translations call him that. But historically, King Xerxes the Great was what he was most well known as. Now next week we'll get to know him a little better as we dive into chapter 1. But what we will see there at least, is that he was married to a beautiful woman by the name of Vashti. In roughly 838 BC, King Xerxes and Vashti decide to, on the very same day, throw a banquet for some very wealthy and famous people in the empire. But it's not one party, it's two separate parties. And at one point, after Xerxes has had a skinful of wine, he decides that he's going to call in his wife Vashti and parade her in front of himself and all of his party. But Vashti refuses. And this refusal is the event that begins the spiral of events that lead to Esther's eventual rise. Vashti, though, is banished from the kingdom, and a royal decree is sent throughout the kingdom that men must rule over their homes. Then chapter 2 begins this way. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Now, how long did this fury last for? Well, it could have been as long as 3 years, 3 bloody and violent years, but we'll look at more of that next week. But to fill the royal bedroom, to make sure that the pillow beside Xerxes' head was filled, a few people within the palace decided to put this on, the first ever Persian bachelor. Now don't get me wrong, Xerxes had plenty of bodies to keep his bed warm, but he needed a figurehead, a queen. And so a group of staff were sent throughout the Persian Empire, collecting all the beautiful and young and most importantly untouched women that they could find. And one of these women brought into the kingdom was a Jewish girl by the name of Hadassah, who went by her non-Jewish name, Esther. Now we aren't told if this is done by choice or by force. But we do know that Esther was an orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, and she was, to paraphrase the Hebrew, absolutely smoking hot. So hot that when she steps into the palace, she's actually risen because of her beauty and how amicable she is. She comes to the top of the pile. But we also find out that Mordecai has told her to keep her Jewishness to herself. Mordecai, her guardian, has told her to do that. Now, eventually she does get her chance to meet the king, and he's so gobsmacked that he doesn't give her a bachelor's rose, he actually gives her a crown. She becomes the queen of Persia. And not long after this, we read, Mordecai also rises to prominence as well, because he foils an assassination attempt against the king. And for his part, Mordecai's name and the story is recorded in the history of the king. Then in chapter 3, we're introduced to another important figure, Haman the Agagite, who for some unknown reason is elevated to second in command of all of Persia. Haman is honoured by all the people, whenever he passes them, but not for Mordecai. Mordecai just refuses to do it. Now this is the second most powerful man in the world, remember, and so he is clearly and obviously offended by Mordecai's deliberate refusal to honour him. Why does Mordecai do that? Well, we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. That's a topic for a later sermon. But Haman is so offended that he decides killing Mordecai just isn't enough. He's actually going to wipe all of Mordecai's people out. He wants to kill every single Jew in the empire. And as a fun fact, it's actually from within Persia that the title Jew originates. The label Jew seems to have been derived from a word or phrase that means from Judah, which is basically where all the people that were in the Persian Empire had come from, because the Assyrians had destroyed the northern half of the kingdom. from Judah was where basically all Jews in Babylon and then in Persia had originally come from. And the label then, the Jews or Judaism, is picked up by the Greeks and the Romans, and it actually continues with us until today as both an ethnic and a religious label for that people. But back to Esther. Haman is given by the king, it seems, this special job of throwing the dice to determine when the day of the year the Persians would celebrate their annual festival. It's this huge annual celebration that they hold. And the dice just so happen to fall on a date 12 months or so in the future, a providence that only makes sense in hindsight. Haman, though, uses this special honoured moment to enact or begin to enact his plan to revenge the honour or the dishonour that was thrown at him by Mordecai. And it's what instigates the major crisis of the book. Reading from chapter 3, verse 8, we see, "Then Haman said to King Xerxes, 'There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves apart and separate. Their customs are different from all other people, and they do not obey the king's law. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury.' So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. 'Keep the money,' the king said to Haman, 'and do with the people as you please.' So word goes out that on a day determined by the dice, all the Jews in the Persian kingdom would be fair game for anyone who wants to kill them. When Mordecai hears about this, though, he rips his clothing and begins mourning. Esther hears about this scene that Mordecai has made, and she sends a servant to inquire what's going on. Mordecai tells Esther exactly what has happened, and he begs her to speak to the king about it. But Esther responds by saying an approach to the king is unlawful. It is taking your own life in your hands. And we read then in chapter 4, verse 2, when Esther's words are reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." It's an incredible statement by Mordecai, and it's one that we're going to look at in more depth later. But the heart of the matter is, it works. Esther is convinced that she's going to risk it all to save the Jewish people. And so she formulates a plan. The first is to approach the king, which actually works. He extends his golden scepter and welcomes her in. She's not going to die. But then, when he sees her, he is so, again, smitten by her beauty that he basically says she can have whatever she wants, even up to half the kingdom. But she simply invites him to a banquet. "Come along," she says, with one other person, Haman the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And so they have this banquet. And Xerxes again asks, "What is it that you want?" Her reply, "Please come again tomorrow night to a banquet," which they both agree to. But on the way home, Haman again bumps into his old mate Mordecai, who neither honoured him or feared him, it says. And that only made Haman's rage towards him greater. So much so that he organises for a pole to be erected with a single purpose, to either hang or impale Mordecai, depending on how you read it. And it wasn't a small pole either. It was almost 7 stories high. Think the top of St. David's spire around the corner from the church. 25 roughly metres high. And Haman decides that the next morning he's going to charge into the palace and ask Xerxes for permission to put Mordecai on that pole. But while Haman is planning Mordecai's murder, King Xerxes is back at the palace having a pretty rough night's sleep. so bad that he asks one of his servants to read him a bedtime story. And his choice of story? The history of the king, Xerxes the Great. And it just so happens that he reads the story, or reaches the part of the story, where Mordecai is the one who saves the king years earlier. Xerxes then asks the servant, "What have we done for this man Mordecai?" To which they say, "Nothing." And so the king decides that tomorrow morning he's going to honour him. And he asks one of his servants to go out into the palace and seek a statesman, whoever the highest statesman in the palace is, who can bestow this honour onto Mordecai, and who just so happens to be walking into the palace at that very moment in the morning? Haman. So Haman is brought by the servants to the king, and the king asks, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honour? Now Haman's thinking, who else would the king want to honour but me? So he goes on to describe this lavish celebration that he desired to experience himself. And Xerxes agrees that is absolutely perfect. That's exactly what needs to be done, but for Mordecai. And Haman's got no choice at this point. He has to do it. But it emotionally cripples him to honour Mordecai throughout the kingdom in this lavish, lavish way. But Haman's still got this second feast with the Queen Esther to look forward to. And so that night, after Mordecai has been honoured, they're sitting there at the banquet. Esther, Xerxes, and Haman. And the king asks again, what is it that you really want? Then Queen Esther answered, I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we'd merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who dared to do such a thing. Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman. Now, in a rage, as Xerxes was prone to do, he storms out. And Haman, who is still emotionally crushed by his day honouring his enemy, realises that his time's up. So he gets down on his knees, seemingly, and begins to beg Esther for his life, which is exactly when the king walks back into the building and he says, will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house? And it's at that point, one of the king's servants points out to the king that there just so happens to be a pole that's been erected outside, ready for an execution. And so Haman ends up on the pole that he put up. Not only is Mordecai honoured that day, Haman is executed. And to make things worse for Haman, his power and responsibility is not given to his sons, it's given to Mordecai. Then in chapter 8, we read that there's still a problem because they need to go about overturning the edict that Haman had established. But there is a snag. The edict signed by the king is one that cannot be revoked. And so they have to create a counter edict. And with the king's approval, it is granted that the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The change in circumstances not only changed the fortune of the Jews, it actually turned the empire, it seems, on its head. In chapter 8, verse 17, we read this, in every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews for fear of the Jews had seized them. People became Jewish because of this. But then the fated day arrives, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. The day the Jews were meant to be destroyed. But on that day, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased with those who hated them. the tables had been turned. Not just on Haman, but on every single person that sought to have the Jews destroyed. And the king even offers them a second day of violent defense, just to be sure that Haman's sons and all his allies are killed. The violence that was meant for the Jews is dished out instead to their enemies. And to celebrate, the festival of Purim is established. Now, Purim is the Hebrew word for dice, pointing to that fateful day where the die was cast by Haman to have all the Jews destroyed. And it turned out that that day was actually the day of their deliverance. And it's still celebrated by Jewish people to this very day. It's a festival where people dress up, where people give each other gifts, and they eat these strange triangular biscuits that are filled with fruit. But the book of Esther is then closed by emphasizing the power of Xerxes and the new second in command, Mordecai, who uses his power to protect the Jewish people. Now that's the story of Esther from beginning to end, and we've got 7 more weeks to dive in and pull it apart. But what is the overarching purpose of the book for us? What's its place for the church in light of Jesus? Well, on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, this is said of Jesus. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. All the scriptures. That would have included Esther. So what does Esther say about Jesus? What would he have taught those people that day that it says about him? What is the true purpose of Esther? Well, I think the clear point, the obvious point, the most overarching point is God's silent providence. The title of this sermon is basically the main point of the book. Though God may not be speaking, he is never silent. God is the one who delivers the Jewish people, not Xerxes, not Mordecai, not even Esther. Sure, they all have a part to play, but all of them just so happen to be at just the right place, at just the right time to do exactly what it is they needed to make sure the Jewish people were rescued. When we stand back, we see that the book of Esther is kind of like, in many ways, a game of chess. There are Jews on one side and their enemies on the other. And as the game progresses, it looks as though the Jews are headed for a very quick checkmate. And yet what we see is actually all the pieces are just where they needed to be at just the right time in order for the tables to be perfectly flipped. And when somebody wins a game of chess, who is it that we congratulate? Do we look at the board and congratulate the pieces? No, that would be nuts. No, we congratulate the player, the person who has moved all the pieces in just the right place. Because the pieces that were there were simply doing exactly what they were meant to be doing. The problem is, in the story of Esther, the biggest player in the game is never mentioned. Because the story is not told from the perspective of God above. No, it is told from the ground below. The perspective of the game of Esther is actually played from the board, not from above. And that is exactly where we live. We don't live and operate from God's perspective. We operate on the ground. We're still on the chessboard today. And yet God has always, is always, and will always have every piece exactly where he wants it for his purposes and glory. Because in the time of Esther and Mordecai, things looked really bad for God's people. Things were not going well. Whether they were in Jerusalem or whether they were in Persia, things were not going well. How would God fulfill his promises to his people if they're wiped off the face of the earth? Well, simply, he couldn't. And so God turned the table on Haman and his partners, his allies, his sons, and the enemies of the Jews were defeated. And they survived. And you can fast forward 2,000 years to 2,000 years ago, and things again were not looking so great for the Jewish people. They're still in 0 AC, AD, BC, whenever it is. They were still under the rule of a foreign power. This time, though, it was the Roman Empire, and though the temple itself had been rebuilt, the hope of the Jewish people was in tatters. But again, God had all the right pieces in just the right places. Because Jesus, the King of Kings, arrived at just the right time, to quote Paul, and to paraphrase Esther. And not only did God in Jesus turn the tables again, literally and historically, he actually changed the game. Because the enemy Jesus defeated was death. And yet in doing that, he shook the whole board. He changed the game. Because the game on this earth was no longer the Jews against the world. It was Jesus and his followers against the world. And in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection and ascension, the end of this game was also made clear. But the game of chess that God has been playing in this world between himself and his enemies continues to this day. All of us are pieces in it, whether we like it or not. And I know this image of simply being a chess piece grates on our natural instincts. What about our free will, we think? What about my own human individuality and responsibility? And yet I'd argue we are actually more like chess pieces than you'd often realise, than you're often willing to admit. We do all have the ability to choose. We do all have free will. But like chess pieces, we each only have our own limited options to choose from. There is only so much choice that any of us have, any human being has on earth. I didn't choose when I was born, to whom I was born, where I was born, when I was born. I didn't choose the genetic material that I was made with. That alone limits who I can be, because God has made me who he needed me to be. But he's also made you who he needed you to be. Sure, some people will be able to do more than others, but the people God has made us to be means we need to be those people. And if he's made us with the ability to do more, it is our responsibility to do more. None of us, though, were made to be queens. None of us that I know, at least, were made to be queens like Esther. Nor are we likely to be ruling officials like Mordecai, second in charge over all the kingdom. No. But we were all made to be something. Because the first step in our life is to accept who God has made us to be. The second step is to living that out. And the third is trusting the one who makes the real moves. So as we begin to consider this book in Esther, who are you? Who has God made you to be? Because that is exactly what you are. And are you going to play your part in God's kingdom, be that big or small? Because if you aren't willing to play that role, then you're probably actually on a different side of the board than the one that you think that you are. And finally, do you trust the one who is really in control? Interestingly, the book of Esther never gives us insight into the real motives of the key players, but it does show us what they did. Because both Esther and Mordecai embraced who, what, and where they were. And because of that, because of them living out their purpose, the Jewish people were delivered. And because of that, Jesus, the focal point of our faith and hope, was born. So as we begin this series, as we begin Esther, as we get on with our lives, may the words of Mordecai to Esther, ring true in our minds. He said, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." God's in control. No matter what we do or don't do, his plan will continue, as Mordecai says to Esther. But God has put you where you are for a reason. Maybe, just a time like this is exactly what you were destined for. But that's not just true of major political maneuverings like it was in Esther. It's true of how we live every day of our lives. God has made you to be who you are for a purpose. He's made you to be a follower of Jesus, to live that out. And it's not so much about what you do, it's more about who you are. Are you willing to be a follower of Jesus? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself? Are you willing to live that? Or at least try and live that? Because if you are, that means you're living out what God called you to be. God's plans don't change. He's put you here to do something, to be something. You are who you are for a reason. You're here, hopefully following Jesus for a time such as this. It's not an accident. None of it is. But what are we going to do about it? Because nothing is never an option. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this book of Esther. And though it's challenging, though it presents us with lots of questions, may we see your hand at work in all of it. And not just in Esther, may we see your hand at work in this world, and may we see your hand at work in our lives. Though it may often feel like you're not speaking, may we recognize you are never silent, and you are never still. May we see that all of human history is working its way towards that moment when Jesus is recognized for who he is. God, may we each recognize the part we are to play. May we accept the role that you have given each of us. May we be willing to embrace who we are. May we be willing to recognize who we are. And in doing that, commit ourselves to living that out. Not seeking to be more than we are, and not denying who we are. May we each individually seek to play our part, to do what is right, to serve you, to love you, to honour you. And we can only do that because of Jesus. And it's in his name we pray.